to now adjourn. Lee Anderson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. We have seen many injustices debated in this House. Just today we've seen the injustice of the Waspy women. In recent weeks we've spoken about the infected blood scandal and more recently the post office scandal. But tonight we're going to debate another scandal. I think is a scandal. It's the Mineworkers Pension Scheme scandal. Now, 25% of the United Kingdom is on top of an old coal mine, on top of a coal field. So I would have hoped there would have been 25% of this chamber would have been full tonight, but it's not. And maybe there's a few reasons for that. It has been debated a lot in this place, especially before I came here and since I came here. So maybe certain MPs are getting a little bit fed up of saying the same old thing, but we'll keep trying. Now, I started the pit in the mid-80s. I went to work at Sutton Colliery in Nottinghamshire, North Nottinghamshire. I went to work there with my dad, Paul Anderson. He was a rope fitter, and I went to work with him underground, and I had a good time working with my dad and my friends at Sutton Colliery. And Sutton Colliery was a family pit. It was a small coal mine, small coal seams, difficult conditions, family pit where brothers worked with dads, worked with granddads. It was a proper community. But like most coal mines, or all coal mines, there was tragedy underground. And in Sutton Colliery in 1957 there was an explosion, a methane explosion, and sadly 5 men lost their lives. And I knew some of the friends and families and descendants of these people that died in 1957. I then went on to Cresswell Colliery to do my coalface training, another family pit in North Derbyshire, where again men work with their sons and brothers work with brothers. Another pit tinged with tragedy. 1950, there was a fire at Cresswell Colliery where 83 men and boys sadly lost their lives. And some of these poor souls, they had to, the mines rescue at the time had to seal the pit off underground to save the colliery, so it could produce coal again. So they sealed some of the old workings off and left the men in by. And because there was no chance of saving them, but just a few months later when they took the stops down, the men was there at the other side of the stops, and some of them had scratched their names into the wall. This is terrible, and this is the sort of thing that's hard to explain to people who's not worked down a coal mine. They're a very tight-knit community, and people working in difficult conditions. I mean, I just had just over 10 years working in awful conditions, but my granddad, Charlie, he had 45 years down the coal mine. He finished up at Norton Colliery. It would have been 50 years, but he took a break between 1940 and 1945 and went to fight Hitler. And then he came back and went straight back down the pit the following week. And when he finished the pit in, I think it was 1979, he got a tankard, a certificate, and 500 quid, and a meagre pension. Imagine that. We knew as miners, when we went down the pit every day, about the risks, the everyday risks that you're going to get underground. I think since mining started in this country in the 1700s, there's over 160,000 men, women and children died in the coal mines. So we knew the risks. We knew there was always a chance that something might happen. But these are the risks we took. And the miners took these risks for just simple reasons, basically to earn a wage and put food on the table and make sure their kids were well dressed, and that's basically it. But in 1994, when I was still at the pit, it was privatised, and in my area it was Budge Mining that took the pits over, RG Budge Mining. And at this time, a big bone of contention was what was going to happen with the MPS, the Mineworkers Pension Scheme, probably one of the richest pension schemes at that time in the world, worth like hundreds of millions, if not billions, in today's money. Now, it was always sort of accepted that there would always be a 70-30 split in favour of the miners. Now, when the government sat around the table with the trustees to make this offer to guarantee the Mineworkers Pension Scheme, we just automatically surmised it would be 70-30. That would have been a fair split. But at the last minute, and it depends on who you talk to, whether it's the trustees at the time or the mining organisations, the men that's involved in campaigning. Nobody can actually get to the bottom of it, but it ended up being, so they say, a 50-50, take it or leave it deal. And the government at the time never took any proper financial risk assessment, actuarial advice on the split, and we can never get to the bottom of that. So it was a simple take it or leave it. And when I was working at the pit with my friends, we never really got a say in this. And I can't remember any man that I worked underground with actually being happy with this 50-50 split, because we knew how rich the pension fund was. Now, since 1994, we're 30 years on, and the government have not paid a single penny into the pension scheme. It is a cash cow. By the way, they've taken £4.8 billion out of the scheme, and this is successive governments, both Labour and Conservative governments, have taken billions out of the scheme. Some of these mining groups will say it's nearer to 10 billion, but I'll take the figures I've got here on my paper. Just in the last 3 years, they've taken over £400 million out these surplus. That's a lot of money. This is miners' money. In effect, the guarantee from the government, from the Treasury, is an insurance scheme. They guarantee that if there's not a surplus, they will make up the shortfall and pay the bonuses, etc. But I can't think of any insurance scheme anywhere in this country or in the world that's never had a claim, that's never had to pay out. In 30 years, not one penny has come from the Treasury or the taxpayer to top up the Mineworkers Pension Scheme. And I think that's a bit of a scandal, and so does my mining community. Now, the 80s and 90s... I will give way.
I'm grateful for the Honourable Member for Ashfield for giving way, but I think we're all agreed. We actually had a debate in this chamber on Thursday, a 3-hour debate with over 30 members contributing, and I think there was unanimity about the unfairness and the injustice of the surplus sharing arrangements. But I'd like to ask a question, in the Honourable Member's former role as Deputy Chairman of the Conservative Party, when the former Prime Minister Boris Johnson visited the coalfield and spoke in Mansfield, and he gave certain undertakings and assurances to reform the surplus sharing arrangements that the miners would get their money back. Is he, as former Deputy Chairman of the Conservative Party, aware of any discussions after that 2019 general election to implement those promises?
Thank my honourable friend for his intervention. When I was Deputy Chairman, and even before that, I spoke to the current Prime Minister when he was the Chancellor of the Exchequer, and to be fair to the current Prime Minister, he did actually look into the scheme and the surplus arrangements. And one of the discussions at the time was that maybe the whole pension scheme could have been given back to the miners and the government not act as guarantor at all. But I would have hoped that during this debate we could have come together a little bit and not try and politically point score. I'm here for my community of mine workers, I'm here for my dad, I'm here for my brother-in-law, I'm here for the people of Ashfield that toiled underground, and I won't get involved in any silly petty politics during this debate. Now, the 80s and 90s, they were difficult times for the mining community. Pits were closing, people were losing their jobs. And then in the 90s, when the pits were closing and the men were out of work, and we saw the injustice of this surplus arrangement with the government at the time, there were other people trying to rip the miners off. These were the spivs, these were the financial advisors that were rocking up in their new Rovers. They were calling in at miners' welfares, working men's clubs, knocking on doors, turning up. These were men in shiny suits that had never done a day's work in their life, and they were conning the miners. They were telling the mine workers at the time, and my dad was one of them, that their pension pot was no good, that the mine workers' pension was no good, it wasn't making money, and they transferred their money over to these private pension schemes, and they were ripped off. But fortunately, just a few years later, a lot of these miners, including my dad, was able to claim compensation against these sharks and put the money back in the MPS, which is, in my mind, probably one of the best pension schemes in the world. Now, we talk about levelling up in this place a lot, and we stood on a manifesto back in 2019 of levelling up areas. And to be fair to the government, we've had lots of money in Ashfield, but about £200 million in Ashfield itself, with 2 new school rebuilds and nearly £100 in high street funding and towns funding, and extra money for our police and CCTV. So I'm incredibly grateful for that to this government. But real levelling up can come in the form of putting more money into people's pockets and letting them decide how to spend that money. And I can't think, really, of a fairer way of levelling up and giving these miners, their widows, their families, a little bit more money in their pockets. I will give way.
Honourable friend for giving way. I know what a great champion he has been for his community on this issue, the rest of Nottinghamshire, indeed nationally, and I've been in many of those meetings that he described earlier with the Prime Minister when he was Chancellor and with other ministers and so on. And I know my honourable friend was a miner indeed in my constituency in Manton and Bassett Law as well, and he's shown me his lamp many times and told me many stories. But does my honourable friend...
I beg to move that this House do now adjourn.
The question is that this House do now adjourn. I hand back to Mr Anderson, who is giving way. Cool.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The point I would like to make, I think, is we were talking about the split, the surplus. I just wonder if my honourable friend shares my frustration with that, as when we believe that some real progress has actually been made there, whether it's on the split or the surplus, or there has been a chance to renegotiate, to have some incremental progress, put some money back into the pockets of those widows, and whether we could make that change over time, whether we could have been in a better position now if it hadn't have been for those who really don't want to negotiate at all and who wanted all or nothing immediately.
Friend for his intervention. He makes some reasonable points. I think, to be fair, the guarantee scheme has worked in that the government has been able to take more risks with the pension fund. It's created a higher yield. And the problem that I've faced as a Member of Parliament when I've been dealing with certain groups is we cannot get the groups to agree on what is the best solution, the best way forward. It's incredibly frustrating. And there's still a lot of bitterness. We're 40 years on from the miners' strike, and I come from a family that was on strike. All my family were striking miners, but there's still that bitterness now that when I get involved, and sometimes when I met some of the mining groups, they've said, oh, keep your nose out, we don't want scabs getting involved in our business because I come from Nottinghamshire. And that's not the way forward. We've got to have a sensible debate like grown-ups, because at the end of the day, there are thousands of ex-miners dying each year. And this pension fund, now it's got to be worth, I don't know, 12, 13, 14 billion pounds. It is a massive pot of money. And when the last miner dies, I mean, I'm 57 now. I'm probably one of the last miners, one of the youngest ex-miners left. All that money that's left in the scheme goes to the Treasury. So we could give the miners a much fairer deal, give them that fairer split. Carry out the recommendations of the Bayes 2021 report to give the miners that money. Because at the end of the day, it doesn't cost the government any money at all. Because in 50 years' time, they're going to get a pension fund, a pension pot, worth literally billions and billions of pounds. So like I said before, Madam Deputy Speaker, the way to level up in areas like mine, which are deprived, which have suffered job losses, which have been de-skilled, which have, really gone through the mill over the past 30 or 40 years, is to give the miners and their families a little bit more money. I'm going to close now, but I will say that I feel incredibly proud to stand up here and represent the people of Ashfield and the mining community in Ashfield, the widows, the ex-miners, some of my old friends that I used to work down the pit with. And all we want from the government is a little bit of justice. We're not asking for much. We're just asking for a little bit more money for the miners and their families in this great country of ours before the last miner dies. Thank you, Madam Deputy.